Welcome to this part two of a four-part series entitled The Archaeology of Israel, Past, Present, and Future. Once again, Dr. Keimer will be our presenter today, and the topic is the methods of dating in archaeology. We hope you enjoy this second session. Welcome to this part two of this four-part series on archaeology. And even though the whole topic of biblical archaeology is a very broad one, in this second session, we're going to talk with Dr. Keimer about methods of dating in archaeology. So welcome, Kyle, and we look forward to your teaching today.
Thanks, John. Good to be here. You're right. Dating and looking at pottery and other things that help us come with the days isn't the most exciting thing, but it's actually one of the most helpful and useful things that we do in archaeology, because if we aren't able to date any of the things that we're finding, then how do we connect them to historical events? And so what I want to do in this section here is just going to give us an overview of the broader framework for dating and understanding, and even give some specific terms so that people are familiar with them. A bit at all relative dating, which is what we do with pottery, and then we'll look at absolute dating, where we're going to delve into some more scientific approaches to establishing the dates of different objects or different layers from sites. Now, I'm sure many people will be familiar with this classical tripartite division of history into the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. Some would even say we're in the fourth age today, which is the Plastic Age. But we have these three main ages that we're going to be dealing with. And really, for the biblical archaeology, the Stone Age is too early. We're really only going to be focusing on the Bronze and the Iron Ages. So Stone Age is what we often refer to as the prehistoric period, that is before any writing was taking place. And this will last up until roughly 3,300 BC in Israel. And it'll be different for different parts of the world, just so you know. So if you're happen to be comparing British archaeology with biblical archaeology, the dates of the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age will actually be quite different, because each of these ages are reached in a different time period, in a different context. So we're focusing largely on that Bronze and Iron Age. And this, again, is going to take us from roughly the end of the fourth millennium BC, so 3,300 BC or so, up until the end of the second millennium. And so the Bronze Age really lasts from about 3,300 BC all the way down to about 1200, 1150, 1130 BC. This is one of the problems we have with these ages, is that people in antiquity didn't use them. These are it's a modern construct, and it's not as if people woke up one day and was like, hey John, it's a new day, guess what, it's the Bronze Age. Hey, oh, actually, I'm sorry, it's the Iron Age today. It's like daylight savings time, we have to change our schedules. So they didn't do that. And so we have to allow for the fact that these aren't hard and fast dates that we're dealing with. And oftentimes, even in the last 150 years, we've refined these dates in kind of academic parlance as we found new material and had to redate some of what we thought we knew.
So in the Bronze Age, we're talking about Canaanite period, an early, a middle, and a later period of the Bronze.
Right. So within each of these ages, that's a good point to bring out, John, is in biblical archaeology, we break that down into an early, a middle, and a late Bronze Age phase. Sure. And then each of those are further subdivided. So there's an early Bronze 1, 2, 3, and 4, a middle Bronze 1, 2, and 3, a late Bronze 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 2A, 2B. Depending who you talk to, you're going to get some different terms. So it's not always the easiest thing to navigate, but the important thing is that we've created these frameworks to help us understand changes in the material culture and or changes in the political record, which is how they're often grouped sometimes. And we're trying to make sense of the material as best we can. And so we have to allow for the flexibility of some of these terms. And it's the same thing with the Iron Age. There's an Iron Age 1, there's an Iron Age 2, which is broken down into an A, B, and C phase.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we get to the end of the Iron Age, which roughly is again from the about 1150, 1130 BC all the way down to 586, some would even push a little bit later, then we move into what we can call historical periods, or at least the terminology used to describe these periods are based on historical names. So
Mm-hmm.
in 586 BC, this we know is when the Babylonians come and destroy Jerusalem. They destroy the temple. They send many of the Judahites into exile. And at 586, we move into what we call the Babylonian period until the Persians defeat the Babylonians. Then we move into the Persian period. And then we move into the Hellenistic period, and then the Roman period, and so on and so forth. So, it's a different. There's two different kinds of names that we use to structure what we're going to be talking about in our discussion here. Now, one of the most important features that was identified for understanding archaeology and the nature of what we're dealing with is that many of these major mounds that you see all over the Near East, we mentioned in the last sessions, are called tells. Tells just means ruin or mound in Arabic and in Hebrew, and other languages have similar phrases as well. And this guy here, William Matthew Flinders Petrie, realized that actually these mounds are not naturally occurring. Up until his time in the late 19th century, everybody thought these were just natural mounds, but he realized, no, actually, these are cities built one upon the next. And if we dig into these mounds, we actually can expose portions of each of these cities and kind of go backwards in history. So the thing with archaeology is the most recent thing is on the top, right? And the deeper you go, the further back in history you go until you get to the bedrock, right? And so if you can dig down the edge of a site, you're going to get a little snippet of each of the different periods in an ideal situation and see what the site looked like at any given time period and get a sense for it. Now, the other thing that goes along with this realization that these mounds are actually artificial and man-made is that the materials that go with them can be, the materials that go with each of these layers changes over time. And so we'll come back to that in just one second. And I just wanted to show an actual picture here of what we call an archaeological vertical face between. So all this has been excavated out, and you have the vertical face here. And what you're looking at here, this is actually from the site of Jericho. Mm-hmm. And you can see there's a whole lot of different colors, things happening. You've got a dark layer down here. Ooh, you've got some sort of solid layer, then a gray layer, some darkish burned areas, but it looks like there might be the face of a wall here. Well, this again is part of the puzzle. And what we do in archaeology is as we dig down, and I mentioned last time that we're destroying everything. And so we need to record what we're doing as best as possible so that others can go back and see what we've done or what was actually there. And as we go down, we want to record things vertically as we're going down, but we also want to record everything horizontally. So as best as possible, we've always tried to capture three-dimensional information so that you can put it back into its original context. And one of the best ways to go back and test whether or not you missed something is to leave behind one of these sections here and to look and say, oh, you know what? I may have just dug right through a nice, beautiful floor and I didn't even realize it. Well, now I know that the material above that floor that I can see in the section is going to date to X, Y, or Z period, and the material below that floor is going to date probably to a different period. And you can actually use that as a corrective in case you miss something. So we like to try and be as careful as possible, but it isn't always possible to identify every single feature, every single layer, even within a site. And so we're always working to improve our methods so that we capture as much information as possible. And here's just another view of one of these so-called step trenches. So again, there's been a big debate in the world of archaeology in Israel, kind of an Israeli school and an American school type of approach. And one, the Israeli school says dig narrow and deep, and get a snippet of. The American school, which says dig narrow and deep, and get an exposure of every period, even though that exposure is really small. And then you have the Israeli approach, which is, hey, let's dig wide, but knowing we're only going to be able to expose a broad area of one period, probably, because there's always limitations to time, resources, energy, funding. We can't just dig everything. So it depends on the type of question you're interested in. Do I want to get a snapshot of the full history of my site, or do I want to focus on one specific period? And it comes down to the questions you're interested in. So these step trenches give us a good way to get such a snapshot. So you don't get a full picture of any individual time period, but you do get a sequence of what the site looked like at different times, as opposed to opening up a giant square.
I believe we see one of these trenches also at Megiddo, don't we?
Yes, there's a huge one there, and to the early excavations in the early 1900s and the early 20th century, that the Germans did, and it's called the basically the Great Cut, and Schumacher dug all the way across the site in a huge deep trench,
broad
and broad. And on the one hand, he exposed a lot of materials. On the other hand, the methodology back in the day meant that we also lost a lot of information that we today now know how to capture. But yeah, there's a huge one there. Jericho has a huge one. And I'm trying to think of any other big sites where you really get this sense. Gezer actually has one that is really huge, and you can still see the individual layers when you look in the section.
Was that the result of McAllister's dig 100 years ago?
No, it was a combination of some of what he left over, and then when Hebrew Union College went back and excavated in the 60s and 70s, they expanded it and kind of connected this entire, almost from the center of the site all the way to outside the southern part of the site. And so it's a really significant type of cut where you can get a snapshot of all the layers. The illustration I put up here is from the site of Ekron, and it gives you, just as a drawing. So sometimes drawings help us to see things a bit better, but it gives you a snapshot of what these look like and how you can see, well, up here, right? Again, the higher you are up in the tell, usually that means you're closer to us in history. And if you want to go further back in history, you dig deeper. You can see there's a wall or some structures here that they've labeled stratum 1, B, and C. So a stratum, just to clarify our terms, is basically just means an individual layer of an occupation. And the study of how individual layers or individual strata connect one to the other is called stratigraphy. And so this is part of the archaeologist tool, is we want to figure out what material, what architectural features belong to which stratum, and then how those might relate to earlier and or later strata as well. So you can see here, this wall is built over top an earlier structure, which itself is partially built over another structure, which as you keep going down, you see sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they reuse the structures and just modify them slightly. And you can identify all of this, usually, oftentimes in the archaeology, if you're careful when you're excavating, you can say, oh, well, this house was actually reused in a later time period because they just raised the floor level. And most of the floors that we have in Israel in the Bronze and Iron Ages are dirt floors, packed earth dirt floors. We don't have, nice, there's no concrete, so to speak of. There's no hard marble floors that are really easy to draw out. It's just a dirt floor. And again, those can be difficult to identify sometimes. But all this to say that what we have, again, is there's a fancy term called the law of superposition. And all that means is that the more recent stuff is on top, the more ancient stuff is underneath or lower down. And you can see how they relate as long as one stratum touches another. If there's no actual physical connection between an object and another object, then we can't always say which one of those might come first and which one might come later. There has to be a physical connection of some sort if we want to create the relationship chronologically between them.
I was just at Ekron actually a week and a half ago, Dr. Kyle. Of course, the site has not been touched for decades, I think now. When's maybe
Yeah, I
the
think they
last
ended in 96, I think is when
90s?
they ended. Yeah.
Yeah, so of course we couldn't see anything. Everything was overgrown, and I saw a couple structures, maybe the gate area of the city, but I really appreciated that diagram. It really illustrates even how certain structures were incorporated into later ones. In fact, I think Dr. Scott Stripling at Shiloh has
Mhm.
uncovered a middle bronze wall, a very broad wall, but apparently
Mhm.
that was incorporated into the Iron Age level as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is particularly those middle bronze walls that we find at a number of sites. They
Hmm.
were built so massively that people just, I mean, they either continue to repatch them and reuse them for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they're not going to take the time and energy to dismantle them. And it really changed the entire landscape of Israel and other parts of the Near East in that time period. So even today, you can go to Hatzor, and the shape of the site itself is largely the result of Middle Bronze Age fortifications
Hmm.
that were established, 1800 BC. So they're massive, they're big.
They are.
Now,
So
in addition,
pottery, wow, here we
yeah,
go.
so in addition to our kind of stratigraphy and our layers, we can use stratigraphy to date certain features in a relative way, but we need more in order to say, when does this wall belong to, or when does this structure belong to. We can see how it relates to what came before and maybe what came after, but the way that we actually give it a date is through the use of pottery and if we're lucky, inscriptions or some other objects. But pottery is the most ubiquitous material you're going to find in the Near East. There are millions and millions and millions of sherds of pottery all over. I mean, you find them on the surface in Israel, just walking through a field. You find them anywhere. When you go to a site, you find them in every layer, and it's everywhere, which is helpful because this is what we use to date things. And again, we come back to our good friend Flinders Petrie, who realized that pottery forms change over time. And he started to realize this by looking at a bunch of tombs in Egypt. And I'll jump ahead here for a second and then maybe come back to that picture. This is one of his charts. He realized that, I'm digging, let's say, tomb 30, and I see these are all the different types of vessels that I see. And then he goes off and he digs tombs 31 to 34. He notices, everything else is different. And he continues digging and says, "Ooh, this kind of bowl continues here." And you see each one. And he realized that certain forms change more readily than other forms. And as a whole, pottery forms change from one time period to the next. And so all you have to do is establish a relative sequence of these forms, and you can create your chronology. And the way he did that is by basically establishing a seriation, which looks like this chart here on the east, what we call
Hmm.
today a battleship curve, because it kind of looks like, a battleship when you look down from the top. And the rationale behind this is that any given type of pottery is going to start out probably not going to be, there's not like a special release date for a brand new type of vessel. It's just some potter says, oh, this is kind of cool, makes it, and then it catches on. Other people start making it and it becomes more populous as you move through the lifespan of it. And then people tire of it and they decide, hey, let's make something different and new. And these battleship curves then, you can look at the frequency in a statistic way to say, when does this vessel appear? When is it the most common? When does it disappear? And how does it relate to other vessels? And by looking at these statistics, we establish our ceramic typology. And so we can say this type of vessel. So if I come back to this one, I can look at these jars here. And once we reconstruct them, I can say they look like they're Iron Age 1 or Iron Age 2A types of vessels, because we know store jars earlier than this look differently. We know store jars later than this look differently as well. because of the relative development of them. Same thing with this shirt here, which has a red slip on it. See, it's got this red kind of layer. This starts Age 1, it continues into the Iron Age 2A, and then they start to do other things look different. And so we can chart all these out, again, based on statistical analysis, both within a site, but then across sites as well. And so for the last, again, 140 years or so, we've been doing this and developing and refining this relative chronology through pottery to the point that, you know, we can pretty clearly date the materials that we find. The problem with pottery is that it changes slowly oftentimes.
Mm.
So let me jump ahead here again and give us a couple images. So again, with relative dating, we're not talking about specific calendar dates. So I can't pick up a piece of pottery and say, this dates to 1075 BC, and we know that it was last produced. I can say what came before it, and I can say what came after it, and based on other evidence, again, say we know goes to the Iron Age 1, and that is tied to the fact that there was an inscription found in a layer with this pottery that mentions Shishak, who is the king of Egypt. And then we go to historical documents to say, well, when did he reign? Oh, well, according to Egyptian records, he reigned in the late 10th century. Now we can go back and say this pottery that we have been trying to figure out and date, we can say that at least it occurred in the 10th century. And then we can figure out, okay, what comes before, what comes after. So as coming back to my point though, the challenge with relative chronology is that our dates are not very limited. So you can look at cars today, or even Coke bottles in, you know, the through up until a couple of years ago when they really didn't change them that much. I can look at a specific model and say, oh, that's a 57 Chevy. Or I can say that's a 56 Chevy, a 55 Chevy. I can identify all three of those, and they came out 1 year after the next, after the next. With pottery, we're looking at timeframes of 50 years, 100 years, 150 years before there's any change. And so if we want to take the pottery and try and figure out the historical significance of it or how it connects, we're going to have a bit of a problem because we can't pin certain ceramic forms to specific historic events or even to specific historical characters. So unless we find a jar that says, you know, David, son of Jesse, father of Solomon, owned this jar, well, all I can say is if it looks like it belongs to the late Iron 1, early Iron 2A, it would be a type of jar that would have existed in David's day, but I can't say that it is connected to him in any way. Right.
So Kyle, let me just interject in my limited archaeological experience in the field. What impresses me so much are archaeologists like you who, after we extract the pottery, we take it back, we wash it, we scrub it, and then you experts then around the table, you decipher it. You count how many pieces came out of this square or whatever, but you know exactly what each piece not only dates to, but the master book, if you will. You almost know it by memory. You know exactly if this piece is a rim of a storage jar or a bowl or a base of a vessel. It's so impressive of how you can identify, to me at least, so easily and so accurately these broken pieces of pottery.
Yeah, and you know, it's one of those things that you learn, and you do it by handling the material, and the more you do it, the more you just have a feel for it, the more comfortable you get with it. But then it's also reading a lot of the discussions out there as well. And I'll share a little personal story. When I took my wife to Israel on a tour once before she was my wife, I kind of showed off and picked up a piece of pottery at a site and said, oh, this is from the Iron Age and blah, 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 blah. And she was impressed. So, You never know. Pottery reading skills can come in handy. So
Yeah,
that
right.
might have. So. So let's jump tracks here. So we have our pottery, our ceramics, and that gives us again our relative dates. So it doesn't pin it to the calendar, just tells us what came first, what came after, so on and so forth. We do have other means of dating things that do give us specific calendar dates, and this is what we call absolute dating. These are types of analysis called carbon-14 or radiocarbon dating or dendrochronology. We even have archaeomagnetism or geomagnetism, where we can use scientific methods to analyze a given material. Sometimes it's organic, sometimes inorganic, and we can situate it in a specific calendar range. So for instance, every living thing in the world is absorbing the radioactive carbon-14 molecule. And then once that creature or animal dies, it stops absorbing it, and the carbon-14 starts to decay. Now we know the rate of decay of carbon-14 through various studies. And what we, in a very simple and straightforward way, all we have to do then, if we want to date something, is we look at it and we measure how much radiocarbon is in it. And then based on where it falls on the curve, we can date that object to that specific time period. And with radiocarbon dating, now we've limited our kind of window of dating to maybe 50 years, maybe 75 years at worst. And we're always developing new methods to analyze this to try and refine the date even better. The problem is we still haven't gotten to a point where, let's say I find a bunch of olive pits that I send for radiocarbon dating, and they give me a date of 930 BC to 900 BC. Let's just say that it's only a 30-year window. Again, what are we trying to do? We're trying to reconstruct the historical narrative, and we want to use the archaeology as best we can. But even with a 30-year window in this specific example, I'm not able to say this structure or this object dates to the reign of Solomon, who we would traditionally say ruled from 970 to 930 BC, or to the days of his son Rehoboam, who reigns at the very end of the 10th century from 930 onwards. Which one was it? Well, I can't say. We know we're in a very narrow window, though, and again, we're working to narrow this window ever more with some of these methods. So the best what we can do is take our relative dates, test them, and refine them with the absolute dating methods, and again, seek to establish our chronology as best as possible. Now, I think decent introduction and jumped ahead, but this is basically the gist of how we know what we know in the archaeological record. We look at the stratigraphy, we look at the material associated with it, and we date it. And again, this is how we're building our narrative of what took place and when it took place. And again, we need to then take that and relate it to our historical sources, whether it be the biblical text or anything else that was written in that time period, and see how they connect.
Well, great material, great insights, Dr. Kyle. Looking forward to part 3. And of course, we'll produce and make this available on our YouTube channel and our website, perhaps in a timely manner. So thanks everyone for tuning in to this part 2. And again, thanks to Dr. Kyle Keimer for sharing his expertise. Have a great day. Until next time, shalom.